My name's Grace, and I used to think I had it all figured out. A great job as head of marketing, a loving husband Mark, and a comfortable life. I was paying off our mortgage with my own salary, feeling pretty damn proud of myself for being financially independent. Family was a big part of our lives, too. Mark had a younger brother, Tom, and their mom, Linda, was always around. Their dad had passed away years ago, so the boys made it a point to look after her. I found it touching, honestly. It made me love Mark even more, seeing how he cared for his family. Linda seemed to like me well enough at first. We'd chat over coffee during family gatherings, and she'd always ask about my work. Marketing, huh, she'd say, nodding approvingly. Sounds important. It felt good to have her approval. I wanted to fit in with Mark's family, to be part of their tight-knit group. Our first few years of marriage were filled with weekend barbecues, holiday dinners, and impromptu game nights with the extended family. I remember one Thanksgiving, all of us crammed around Linda's dining table, laughing and talking over each other. "Pass the gravy, will ya?" Mark's uncle bellowed from the end of the table. "You've had enough gravy, old man." Linda shot back, but she was grinning as she handed over the boat. I looked around the table, taking in the familiar faces, feeling a sense of belonging. This was my family now, too. The first cracks started to show during a New Year's Eve party at Linda's house. I was in the kitchen, refilling my glass of wine, when I overheard Linda talking to Mark and Tom in the living room. "Did you see what Carol's wearing?" Linda snickered. "That dress must have cost all of $5. I froze, my hand on the bottle. Carol was Mark's cousin, a single mom struggling to make ends meet. "I'm just saying," Linda continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Some people should know their limits. Don't try to play with the big boys if you can't keep up." I felt my cheeks burn with second-hand embarrassment. This wasn't the warm, welcoming family I thought I knew. I peeked around the corner, watching as Linda leaned in conspiratorially to her sons, all three of them giggling like schoolchildren. As time went on, I couldn't ignore the growing unease I felt around Linda. What I'd initially brushed off as harmless teasing started to look a lot more like meanness. And it wasn't just Carol who was in her crosshairs. At every family gathering, Linda would huddle with Mark and Tom, their heads close together as they whispered and snickered. Their eyes would dart around the room, landing on various relatives and friends, before they'd burst into muffled laughter. One Easter Sunday, I couldn't take it anymore. Linda was holding court in the living room, Mark and Tom flanking her like loyal subjects. "Did you see Janet's new car?" Linda was saying, her voice low, but not low enough. "Probably got it from the buy here pay here lot. I bet she'll be paying it off until she's 80. Before I knew what I was doing, I was on my feet, marching over to Linda's little group. "Hey," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Don't you think that's a bit much? Janet can probably hear you." The room went silent. Linda's eyes narrowed as she looked up at me. Well, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we've offended your delicate sensibilities, Grace." Mark and Tom exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I just think it's rude," I pressed on, my heart pounding. "Why do you always have to put people down?" Linda's fake smile disappeared. "If you don't like it, you don't have to listen. Why don't you go sit somewhere else?" I felt like I'd been slapped. I looked at Mark, expecting him to back me up, but he just stared at the floor. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. "I will." From that day on, family gatherings became a special kind of hell. I'd sit alone, nursing a drink, while Mark stuck to his mother's side like glue. He'd throw me apologetic glances now and then, but he never came to sit with me. "Why don't you ever stand up to her?" I asked him one night after a particularly awful dinner. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's my mother, Grace. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell her she's being cruel. I want you to have my back." But he never did. And slowly, I started finding reasons not to go to these family events. Work emergencies, migraines, anything to avoid the cold stares and whispered insults. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, life threw me another curveball. I was pregnant. I stared at the little plastic stick in my bathroom, my heart racing. 2 pink lines. Clear as day. "Mark," I called out, my voice shaky. "Can you come here?" He appeared in the doorway, his face concerned. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, I held out the test. His eyes widened as he took it from me. He pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, I felt like maybe everything would be okay. Maybe this baby would bring us closer together, heal the rifts that had been growing between us. But life had other plans. The pregnancy was rough from the start. Constant nausea, dizziness, and a perpetual threat of miscarriage kept me on edge. My doctor put me on bed rest, which meant working remotely. As the weeks went by, my condition worsened. My eyesight started to deteriorate rapidly, a rare complication that my doctor said could be temporary, but might also be permanent. Squinting at my laptop became impossible. With a heavy heart, I had to quit my job. I needed Mark more than ever, but he seemed to be drifting away. He'd come home late from work, citing extra projects or drinks with colleagues. More often than not, I'd fall asleep alone, the echo of the front door closing jolting me awake in the middle of the night. The day of my C-section arrived faster than I expected. My eyesight had worsened to the point where the doctors insisted on the procedure. Natural birth was just too risky. As I lay on the cold operating table, my heart raced with a mix of excitement and fear. "Where's Mark?" I asked the nurse, my voice trembling. She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Your husband's in the waiting room, dear. He said he'd rather stay there." The surgery went smoothly, and soon I heard the most beautiful sound, my son's first cry. As they placed him on my chest, I felt a rush of love so intense it took my breath away. Later, in the recovery room, Mark finally showed up. His face was a mask of discomfort and annoyance. "Look, Grace, I gotta say something. This whole thing? It's not right." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "Normal women give birth on their own, without all this surgery crap. And men? We're not supposed to be here for this. We should be meeting our wives and kids at home, like in the old days." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Mark, I couldn't risk." "Save it," he cut me off. "I'm heading home. This place gives me the creeps." The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Mark was rarely home, and when he was, he contributed nothing to our son's care. Instead, he'd complain constantly. "Can't you shut him up?" he'd growl as our baby cried in the middle of the night. "I'm trying," I'd say, exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "He's teething, Mark. It hurts him." But Mark had no patience for it. "All you do is focus on the kid. What about me, huh? What about our sex life?" I'd stare at him in disbelief. Here I was, running on 2 hours of sleep, still recovering from major surgery, and he was worried about sex. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's dissatisfaction grew. One evening, as I was trying to soothe our fussy 6-month-old, he dropped a bombshell. "You need to go back to work," he said flatly. I turned to him, shock written all over my face. "What? But the baby?" "We'll hire a nanny," he interrupted. "We can't keep living like this, Grace. We need the money." I wanted to argue, to tell him that our son needed me, that I wasn't ready. But the determined look in his eyes told me it was pointless. So, with a heavy heart, I started job hunting. Finding work with my compromised vision wasn't easy. I eventually landed a position at a smaller company, but the pay was less than what I'd earned before. When I told Mark, his reaction was predictably negative. "That's it?" he scoffed. "We're paying a nanny for this?" I felt tears pricking at my eyes. "I'm doing my best, Mark. It's not easy with my eyesight." "Excuses," he muttered, walking away. And so began my new reality, rushing to work each morning, guilt gnawing at me as I left my baby with the nanny, struggling through the day with my limited vision, then coming home to a resentful husband and a child who needed me. Time flew by in a haze of work, childcare, and mounting tension at home. Before I knew it, 2 years had passed since my son's birth. Despite the challenges, I loved him fiercely and found joy in his every milestone. Family gatherings remained a source of stress, particularly due to Linda's behavior. She'd sweep in, playing the doting grandmother for show, but her indifference was palpable. "Come to Grandma," she'd coo, arms outstretched to my son. But he'd cling to me, turning his face away from this unfamiliar woman. Linda's face would darken with anger. "What have you been telling him about me?" she'd hiss. "You're turning my own grandson against me." I'd try to explain, my voice tired. "He just doesn't know you well, Linda. If you visited more often." "Don't you dare blame this on me," she'd snap, stomping off to complain to Mark. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, my world tilted on its axis once again. I stared at the pregnancy test in my hand, my heart racing. Positive. I was pregnant. Again. Fear gripped me. My first pregnancy had been so difficult, my health so compromised. Could my body handle another? But as I calculated the weeks, I realized I was already well into the first trimester. The decision, it seemed, had been made for me. With shaking hands, I called Mark at work. "What is it?" he answered, his tone impatient. "Mark, I'm pregnant." There was a long pause. Then, "Look, Grace, I'm busy. We'll talk later. Just, don't quit your job, all right? We can't afford that." The line went dead. I sat there, phone in hand, feeling more alone than ever. Thankfully, this pregnancy proved easier than my first. My morning sickness was manageable, and my vision remained stable. I continued working, determined to provide for my growing family. But as my belly swelled, the distance between Mark and me seemed to grow exponentially. He spent more and more time at his mother's house, often not coming home until late at night. One evening, as I struggled to put our son to bed while balancing my swollen belly, Mark walked in. "Hey," I said, hopeful for some help. "Can you read him a story? I'm exhausted." Mark glanced at us, then at his watch. "Can't. I promised Mom I'd help her move some furniture." "Don't wait up." As the door closed behind him, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I looked at my son, his big eyes staring up at me trustingly, and at my rounded belly, home to a child I already loved fiercely. As my 7th month of pregnancy rolled around, I found myself preparing for Thanksgiving. Guests started arriving in the afternoon. My parents came early, my mom immediately rolling up her sleeves to help in the kitchen. Friends and relatives trickled in, filling our home with chatter and laughter. Just as I was about to serve dinner, the doorbell rang. It was Tom, Mark's younger brother, and to everyone's surprise, he had a woman with him. "Everyone, this is Melissa," Tom announced, beaming. "My fiancé." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in congratulations. I plastered on a smile, trying to ignore the twinge of jealousy at the way Mark's eyes lit up at the sight of his brother's happiness. Linda arrived shortly after, her eyes widening as she took in Melissa. Well, she said, her voice dripping with approval. "Aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" Throughout dinner, Linda fawned over Melissa, peppering her with questions and hanging on her every word. I tried to focus on being a good hostess, but I couldn't help overhearing their conversation. "So, Melissa," Linda said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Tom tells me you're a manager at National Bank. How prestigious." Melissa nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Yes, I've been there for about 5 years now." Linda beamed. "You must be doing very well for yourself. Unlike some people who can only pop out babies and breed poverty," she added, throwing a pointed look in my direction. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. My mother tensed beside me, ready to speak up, but I placed a hand on her arm, silently pleading with her not to make a scene. "You know," Linda continued, her voice sickeningly sweet, Melissa here makes $15,000 a month. Now that's the kind of daughter-in-law I've always dreamed of. Smart, beautiful, successful. Tears pricked at my eyes as I remembered the years I'd spent supporting our family, paying the mortgage, building a career I was proud of. All of that seemed forgotten now. I think we should continue this lovely evening somewhere more suitable, Linda announced, standing up. Melissa, dear, why don't we all go to that new restaurant downtown? My treat, of course. Before I could process what was happening, Linda, Mark, Tom, and Melissa were heading for the door. Mark didn't even glance back at me as they left. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the festive mood thoroughly ruined. One by one, they made their excuses and left, leaving only my parents behind. They offered to help me, but I refused, saying that they needed to rest themselves. Finally alone, I sank onto the couch and let the tears flow freely. Hours passed as I sobbed, my hand resting on my swollen belly, wondering how my life had come to this. It was nearly dawn when I heard the front door open. Mark stumbled in, reeking of alcohol and cigarette smoke. He didn't say a word as he made his way to the bedroom. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and opened social media. There they were, Linda, Mark, Tom, and Melissa, grinning for selfies at an expensive nightclub. The caption read, "Best Thanksgiving ever with my real family." As my due date approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The doctors had scheduled my C-section, insisting it was the safest option given that it had been less than 3 years since my last one. I tried to focus on preparing for our new arrival, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Mark. One chilly winter afternoon, I found him unpacking bags full of summer clothes. "What's all this?" I asked, puzzled. Mark shrugged, barely meeting my eyes. "Just saw a good sale. Thought I'd update my wardrobe." It didn't make sense, but with the impending birth occupying my thoughts, I pushed my suspicions aside. I'd been meticulously saving money in a separate account, determined to take a couple of months off work to recover and bond with the new baby. My workplace had approved 2 months of unpaid leave, which was a relief. I'd set aside enough for the mortgage, bills, and even a babysitter for our 3-year-old. For once, I felt prepared. 3 days before my scheduled C-section, chaos erupted. I was resting on the couch when Mark burst through the door, Linda hot on his heels. "Hurry up," Linda barked as Mark rushed to our bedroom. I struggled to my feet, waddling after them. Mark was throwing clothes into a suitcase, the summer clothes he'd bought. "Mark?" I said, my voice rising with panic. "What are you doing?" He barely glanced at me. "Tom's getting married in Hawaii. We're all going." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "What? But my C-section is in 3 days. Who's going to take care of our son?" Mark zipped up his suitcase, finally meeting my gaze with cold indifference. "You'll manage. You always do." Before I could respond, he brushed past me, Linda ushering him out. The door slammed, leaving me in stunned silence. Reality crashed over me like a tidal wave. I scrambled for my phone, hands shaking as I checked our joint account. Empty. All the money I'd saved, gone. With trembling fingers, I dialed Mark's number. He answered on the final ring. "What?" he snapped. "The money," I choked out. "All our savings. Where is it?" There was a pause, then a cold laugh. "We needed it for Tom's wedding gift. Don't be so greedy, Grace." The line went dead. A sharp pain lanced through my abdomen. I looked down in horror to see a puddle forming at my feet. My water had broken. Panic seized me. I couldn't go into labor now. The risk to my previous C-section scar was too great. With one hand on my belly and the other clutching my phone, I called emergency services. The hospital was chaos, doctors shouting, machines beeping. I woke hours later to the gentle beeping of monitors. My mother's tear-stained face swam into view. "Grace," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "You're okay. The baby's okay." Slowly, the fog lifted. I'd nearly died. My baby had nearly died. But we'd made it. 3 days after the emergency C-section, I was feeling surprisingly strong, both physically and emotionally. The doctors were pleased with my recovery and gave me the green light to go home. Mark hadn't called once since he'd left for Hawaii. Not to check if I was alive, not to ask about his new son. In that moment, I knew our marriage was over. I called my parents and asked to stay with them for a while. Their response was immediate and supportive. My parents doted on both boys, giving me time to rest and recover. I started researching divorce lawyers and gathering documentation of our finances. Then, exactly a week after I'd left the hospital, my phone rang. Mark's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail twice, before finally answering on the third call. "Where the hell are you? Why aren't you at home?" Mark's voice was a mixture of anger and confusion. I took a deep breath. "I'm at my parents', Mark. With both of our sons. I've filed for divorce." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a bark of laughter. "Divorce? Are you kidding me? After everything I've done for you? Everything you've done?" I felt a surge of anger. "You mean like abandoning me right before I gave birth? Or stealing all our savings?" "Oh, get over it," he scoffed. "I'll pay you back, no problem. In fact, I don't even want to see you again. You know why? Because I'm going to be rich." He launched into a tirade about how Tom's new wife had offered him a job as her deputy at the bank. How they were going to start their own financial company. How she was going to make them all wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. "You never believed in me, Grace," he spat. "You always shot down my ideas, always held me back. Well, guess what? I'm free now. And you? You're just a loser who can't see potential when it's right in front of her." The divorce proceedings moved quickly. To my surprise, Mark didn't contest anything. He returned the money he'd taken from our accounts and agreed to pay alimony. When it came to the house, I had years of mortgage statements proving I'd been the one making payments. The judge awarded it to me without hesitation. The day I returned to my house with the boys, Mark was there, packing up the last of his things. He sneered as I walked in, the baby in my arms and our toddler holding my hand. "Enjoy this dump while you can," he said, hefting a box. "I'll be in a mansion soon, swimming in cash. You'll see what you missed out on." As he walked out the door, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house suddenly felt bigger, brighter. A year and a half had passed since the divorce. Life had settled into a new normal for me and my boys. I'd returned to work, finding a balance between my career and motherhood. It wasn't always easy, but we were happy, healthy, and thriving. One ordinary Tuesday, my phone buzzed with a news alert. As I read the headline, my jaw dropped. "Local banker exposed as fraud, leaves family in ruins." The article detailed a shocking scandal. Melissa, Tom's wife, had been running an elaborate con. She'd convinced Mark, Tom, and Linda to take out massive loans to fund a non-existent financial company. They'd even mortgaged Linda's house, pouring every penny they had into this imaginary venture. But Melissa wasn't a banker at all. The office she'd shown them was a short-term rental, a prop in her elaborate scheme. She'd disappeared with millions, leaving behind a trail of forged documents and broken dreams. To make matters worse, I discovered they'd taken out an additional loan to fund Tom and Melissa's lavish Hawaiian wedding, the very event Mark had abandoned us for. As I read on, a mix of emotions washed over me. Shock, confusion, and, I'll admit, a twinge of satisfaction. The consequences were severe. Unable to repay their debts, they lost everything. Linda's house, their cars, even their personal belongings, all seized by creditors. They were left with nothing but mountains of debt. I heard through the grapevine that Linda had been forced to take a job as a cashier just to afford a tiny apartment and groceries. Mark and Tom were in similar straits, their dreams of wealth and success shattered. I was beyond grateful that I divorced Mark when I did. My children and I were safe, unaffected by the financial disaster that had befallen my ex-husband's family. Just when I thought I'd put it all behind me, my phone rang. Linda's number flashed on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Grace? Linda's voice was small, a far cry from her usual imperious tone. We need your help. She launched into a plea, asking if they could stay with us. The children need their father and grandmother, she insisted. You can't leave family in trouble. I took a deep breath, memories flooding back, of Thanksgiving humiliation, of being abandoned before my C-section, of the countless times they'd belittled and dismissed me. Family? I said, my voice steady. You weren't concerned about family when you left me alone, pregnant, and in danger. You weren't concerned about family when you stole my savings. You weren't concerned about family when you called me a loser. Linda started to protest, but I cut her off. I'm sorry you're in this situation, Linda. But I'm not responsible for the choices you, Mark, and Tom made. My priority is my children, and I won't expose them to the chaos you've created. Please don't contact me again. I hung up, then immediately blocked her number. As I set down the phone, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was done. Truly done.